back in the 80s, Nintendo was the king of video game design. I mean, who can blame you when you make the king of platformers, Mario? So many companies over the years have tried to replicate the magic that Nintendo made with this Italian plumber. There are of course the iconic Sonic the Hedgehog and Crash Bandicoot, but then there are the ones that are very obscure, for better and for worse. But in the past few years, a lot of obscure platformers, or thought to be dead franchises, managed to make a comeback, even Bubsy of all people. With 2022 being one of the biggest comebacks for platformers with KO the Kangaroo, and the franchise we're going to be talking about, Klonoa. Back in December, I actually made a poll of which franchise I should talk about next, and Klonoa was the lucky winner. Sorry, Little Tail Bronx, maybe next time. During my development of this retrospective, Namco announces Klonoa Phantasy Reverie Series, a full-fledged remake of both Door to Phantomile and Lunatea's Veil. And trust me when I say that was probably the highlight for me of this Nintendo Direct. That and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Live Alive actually looks really cool. Mario Strikers. Actually, you know what? In hindsight, that Nintendo Direct was really awesome. Of course, considering we're going to be talking about the first Klonoa game, obviously we should talk about his origins, or development. Klonoa was created by Hideo Yoshizawa, who has been in the gaming industry since its resurrection from the gaming crash thanks to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yoshizawa was behind some of the biggest titles in gaming history, for obvious reasons. I mean, he made Ninja Gaiden, for better and for worse. But during the late 90s, he started working with Namco, and Namco wanted to make a new IP for the massively successful PlayStation 1. Now, funnily enough, the original design was a golem-like creature, but Yoshizawa decided to do something a bit more cuter, and that was the creation of one of the most underappreciated IPs in gaming history, Little Tail Bronx. I'm kidding, obviously Klonoa. Trust me, Cybercrick, I will do an entire video on your series. And this led to the very first game of the series, Klonoa Door to Phantomile. Klonoa Door to Phantomile was released in 1997, published by both Sony and Namco, and developed by both Namco and Payon DP, a Japanese game developer who has quite the library for games they co-developed. The game begins with Klonoa's main item, called the Wind Ring, slowly falling from the sky. The first cutscene shows Klonoa walking in the forest, and the Wind Ring lands near Klonoa and awakens a blue ball named Yupao. We see them potentially forming a bond, and then the world ends. Kidding, it was all a dream. Or was it? Just want to say that's going to be a running thing throughout this series. We later see a strange thing crash into Bell Hill. Klonoa and Yupao go off to investigate, thus beginning the game. Controls for the game are incredibly simple. So obviously you use the C stick or the D-pad to move around. By pressing the X button you can jump, and if you hold it you'll do a light hover, which is great for platforming, and pressing the circle button will allow you to fire a wind bullet. And your enemies for the game are too bloody adorable to really be called enemies. This subspecies is one of the most iconic in the Klonoa franchise, called moos, which is kind of weird considering they look more like bunnies and not cows. Actually, that's something I should mention about Klonoa. Klonoa is a unique species of creature that was made by Yoshizawa. Having features of a dog, cat, and rabbit, fans of the series have considered him a cabbage. Wait, no, that's not right. Klonoa as a species has been referred to as a cabbit, a cat rabbit. I kind of say he kind of looks more like a dog, like the ones with the big floppy ears. Which is how Klonoa is capable of doing that hovering, and the hovering is used for one thing, 2D platformer, which makes Klonoa the odd one out when it comes to the PlayStation 1. With games like Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot emphasizing more on 3D platforming, Klonoa, however, decides to keep more to his roots of his ancient ancestors in the next age of gaming. The only difference is, even though most of the characters in this game are in 2D sprite form, the areas around them, including the terrain, is all in 3D. Which gives the 2D platform more of a 3D element, as there are moments when Klonoa can even look forward and backward, or go forward and backwards in a platformer, where you can change the axis of where you're going in certain points of the level, giving the 2D sprite characters extra dimension to their design, making Klonoa creative in level design, and what a lot of people, especially Categories, call 2.5D platforming. And you can't have a platformer without collectibles. Obviously, one of the most common ones you'll be finding are these little jewels. If you collect 100, you'll earn an extra life. There's also tokens that will give you an automatic extra life. There's these little creatures in bubbles that'll give you double jewels for a limited amount of time, and you'll come across bubbles with people inside symbols, each symbol representing the type of species that's in the world of Klonoa. These are the citizens of Phantomile, and depending where you are in the game, the type of citizen you'll rescue depend on which vision you'll access. Levels in the game are broken down into two-part visions, each story element acting like a two-part story. The first half is usually the beginning of the story, and the second half is the end of the story, with a boss at the end of the second vision. The visions are based off many different places within the world of Phantomile, with the first world being Breezegale, home of the Bell Hill, is home to the Cabot-like people like Klonoa. Warlock is a jungle full of tribal-based people, with a nice forest structure and treetop villages. Jugpot is an aquatic kingdom, which you can kinda consider like Atlantis. And there are soldiers, and are probably the cutest soldiers in gaming, on par with the Waddle Dee. There's Coronia, and I'm sorry for the poorly timed name, which is a steampunk-like floating fortress. And lastly is Cress, the legendary Moon Kingdom and home of Hupao. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should probably explain the story. Now, considering that Fantasy Reverie is going to be coming out later on this year, and I'll do a video when that comes out. By the way, Bandai Namco, can you get me a physical copy of the Switch version, please? Thank you, love you. So, I will be putting a spoiler ahead. So skip to this part of the video if you don't want to be spoiled. When we arrive at Bell Hill, we meet a dark being known as Gaudius, who's kidnapped the idol of the Moon Kingdom, Laphise, who we learn, thanks to this big guy named Baloo, is actually the idol of the legendary Moon Kingdom, and her song is used for healing abilities. Gaudius wants to turn the world of Phantomile into a kingdom of nightmares, and must use Laphise's song in order to awaken Nahatum, a nightmare creature in a long slumber that would bring disaster to all of Phantomile. But to get to the Moon Kingdom, we must find a moon pendant Klonoa happened to find, and give to his grandpa. Later on, Gaudius' henchman, Joka, tries to take the pendant by killing Klonoa's grandpa. Oh, did I forget to mention, this series can get very dark and emotional at times. Now, this is actually something I should mention about Klonoa's design in game. Though Klonoa may look like a cutesy adventure, in truth, that is far from the point. Yoshizawa actually wanted to make a video game that would be both entertaining for kids and investing for adults. So obviously killing your grandpa was one of those things that they added to, raise the emotional damage. And trust me when I say, we are far from done with all the emotional damage. As we head to the Moon Kingdom and discover Hupao is actually the prince of the Moon Kingdom with a human form. But more on that later, as we have to defeat Gaudius. But sadly, he summons Nahatum before his death, and with the combined power of the kingdoms and friendship, we slay the nightmare monster Nahatum. The day is saved, and we get our happy ending, right? Wrong. After everything, Hupao tells Klonoa that Phantomile isn't his world, and Klonoa is shocked and flat out denies Hupao's words. Can't blame him, his grandpa died. Wait, was he even his grandpa? To make the ending even sadder, apparently, when Laphise starts singing to heal the world, Klonoa is forced to leave Phantomile, and both Hupao and Klonoa don't want to say goodbye. Klonoa is gone, and the game ends with pictures of your adventure, and the cover with your name on it, which I'll go into more detail about next time. Klonoa may look like a cute game, but it can get really dark and depressing at times. Basically, Klonoa was pulling a Kirby before Kirby was pulling a Kirby, which also makes it really weird considering there's an epilogue level. By beating the game, you unlock an extra level that puts Klonoa's platforming to the test, to where I honestly couldn't have beat it. But if you beat it and you rescue all the citizens and get to meet Laphise, you unlock a music player. At the time, it was a great reward for beating the game, because the music in this game I think is really good. There are just generally a lot of things I really liked about the game. Structured the platforming, the unique puzzle-based platforming elements using the characters. But I do have some noteworthy gripes to the game. The game itself is still designed for kids and can be easily beaten in a matter of hours. But the story-based gameplay makes it really interesting. Though the 3D level design can be a little tricky, especially when it comes to throwing enemies at the foreground. Just when I say that got really annoying for me when I faced Joka during a boss fight. Not to mention the momentum-based structure that Klonoa does have in his platforming. When Klonoa keeps running around, and when he finally makes a stop, he slides a little, making some of Klonoa's platforming somewhat slippery. The platforming I still say is really good, but that's usually something easy you can handle, especially if you hold the hover button and you don't really slide. But you kind of stay in place in the air, basically sacrifice momentum-based jumping with more easy landing platforming. Though when you pick up and inflate enemies, yes, that's a real thing that you can do in Klonoa, forgot to mention that. You can't really use the hover ability, but instead you do get a double jump, and of course that double jump does give you more jumping ability, but it's how you use it for certain situations. And even though if you destroyed an enemy during a specific part where you need it for a collectible, no worries, most of the enemies tend to respawn automatically, adding a bit more of that easy gameplay that I mentioned before. And lastly, I think one of my biggest gripes with the game, now this is something that I'll talk about again in my next video in Lunatea's Veil, but I feel like the bond of both Klonoa and Hupao is too forced. Like, I don't really see their bond throughout the game. They just chatter a bit and they live together, giving the idea of their friendship being off-screen, and when Hupao throws that massive truth bomb to Klonoa, their bond kind of felt that way, because that's kind of how it was. But I think when Hupao was wanting to tell the truth about Klonoa's, origins, he really wanted to be his friend, not a lie that he made himself. Its ending is still really emotional, but yeah, we'll get there when we get there. Klonoa, Door to Phantomile may seem like a simple 2D platformer at first, but its story, characters, and platform gameplay makes me regard it as one of the best platformers on the PlayStation, on par with both Crash Bandicoot and Spyro. So I just have to ask, why didn't the Wii version get as much love? During the 2000s, company Namco actually merged with another company called Bandai and eventually became Bandai Namco. And they were really interested in making tons of new games, though there was interest to bring Klonoa back to the limelight. And they tried that in 2008 with Klonoa on the Wii. This time published by Bandai Namco, and it was actually developed again by Pound DP, who returned as a developer for the remake. And honestly, there's not really much to say about this game. It's a scene-by-scene retelling of the first game, just with better graphics, sort of, a redesign of Klonoa, which fans actually voted for as the original concept was gross, and they also added English voice acting. For most of the characters, it was really interesting, except for Klonoa. He sounded like a Sonic the Hedgehog character.
Come on, let's go! To take it easy and rest. After all, you don't have to worry about Natum now.
The controls are also the same, but I do think the platforming has improved a bit, and you can actually use multiple control settings for the Wii version, whether it be holding the Wiimote sideways, nunchuck, using a classic controller, and of course, a GameCube controller, unless you're playing on the Wii U. Then the GameCube controller is a no-no. Yoshizawa also returned as a producer of this game instead of the director. I mean, what's the point of directing a remake besides, building everything the way it was back from scratch? There are a lot of interesting things about the game I find interesting. Of course, the voice acting. This time around, I did play it in English just to hear what the voices sounded like in English. One of the most interesting voice actors was the voice of Hupao. Hupao is voiced by Laura Bailey. Yes, Toru Honda English dub Fruits Basket Laura Bailey. Another thing I didn't realize also when playing the last game, and that's how much the levels are interconnected with one another. The areas from the background are actual areas you eventually go to within the game. I didn't really notice it that much, mostly because of the polygons of the old PlayStation 1 graphics, but with the Wiimake, you see a lot of the things that make up the game, whether it's in the level design or even the platforming. They also fixed Klonoa's momentum issue I had with the first game, but instead of getting 6 hit points, you actually get 10 this time before you lose a life. But it might be me, but it made me feel like damage boosting through most of the game, making me lose most of the challenge that was in the original. But of course, I beat the whole game again, and after beating it, you unlock a few exclusive things that you can even play in the Wii version. Obviously, there is the challenge mode, but now there are new other mode too, such as a 3D model viewer where you can see all the characters that are in the game, a theater mode where you can rewatch clips from your adventure, a reverse mode that lets you play the entire game, but the levels are mirrored, kind of pointless, a time attack where you can beat all the bosses as quick as possible, and a costume changing area where you can change Klonoa's outfit to his original outfit from Door to Phantomile, the iconic Klonoa 2 outfit, and a festival themed outfit. Also, for some reason, it's at the burnt remains of your grandpa's house. I mean, that is probably where Klonoa lived and that's where his clothes are, but why is it still burned to the ground? But ironically enough, the first Klonoa game was also his last. As until recently, Klonoa has laid dormant for 13 years, and that's mostly due to how the Wii version sold very poorly. Due to little to no advertisement of the game, I mean, I kid you not, I think I only saw one Klonoa commercial on TV my entire life. Not to mention that there were many cartoon-like characters on the Wii, found in both big IPs and terrible shovelware. Klonoa just kind of fit in with the crowd, and was lost to obscurity. Bandai Namco, I believe, learned their lesson from the Wiimake, as I think announcing Klonoa on a Nintendo Direct was a smart move. And with how advanced the internet has gotten since '08, I believe Klonoa will make the comeback he truly deserved, and hopefully with an upcoming continuation of the Klonoa franchise. With that, we can conclude our look back on Klonoa Door to Phantomile. And with the first game down, the next game in our Klonoa retrospective is the sequel that doesn't get as much attention as it should. So tune in next time as I take a look at Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil. Hey guys, this is the Unlucky AngelStar, and we're back continuing our retrospective on the Klonoa series. If you haven't checked out my last video, I actually did a rundown on the first Klonoa series, both the original and the remake. Though the Klonoa series is not really that obscure, it's kind of crazy that the first title on both versions goes for quite a lot of money on the internet. Which is also ironic considering Door to Phantomile was a surprisingly great success, even getting a few awards of being best platformer. I mean, the game itself was so much of a success, Namco decided to finally make it a long-awaited sequel and a spin-off series, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. In fact, Sony actually really liked Klonoa so much that you could kind of say Klonoa was sort of like a PlayStation IP of both Sony and Namco, which is why most of the mainline games have been mostly exclusive on the PlayStation. And you'll probably see why when I talk about Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil. Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil released exclusively on the PlayStation 2 in 2001. The game was developed and published by Namco themselves, and also Sony was a secondary publisher, which is why Klonoa 2 is exclusive to the PS2. At least until Phantasy Reverie gives us the long-awaited remake of the sequel. With Klonoa moving to the next generation of consoles, of course there were a lot of things they had to improve upon that were in the sequel. And considering this is a sequel, it takes place right after the first game, which I explained in my last video, had Klonoa leaving Phantomile. And this time around we're entered in the land of Lunatea. The game begins just like the last game, ironically enough. The wind ring begins slowly falling from the sky, and you see words explaining something related to what's going to be the basis of our new world in this game, Lunatea's Veil. Klonoa in a brand new outfit before, he starts drowning. Hopefully this doesn't lead to some new character development, until he's rescued by a girl named Lolo and a dog with Chaos Emeralds jammed into his eyes, Popka. And unlike the first game, where you're secretly told what a dream travel is, Lolo mentions Klonoa is a dream traveler and asks for his help ringing a bell on an island, which begins our first vision of the game. And just playing the game itself, it plays just like the first game, using the D-pad or analog stick, depending on your choices, to move around, pressing the X button to jump and holding it to hover, and the O button to use the wind ring, to inflate enemies, which you can use as projectiles or as a double jump. Also, late in the game, I actually learned there's a button where you can actually do taunts. After navigating through the level and helping Lolo, we're introduced to a fortune teller named Baguji, who foretells of a dream traveler, aka Klonoa, appearing in the land of Lunatea, in order to ring the bells of the four kingdoms in order to save Lunatea from the threat of the Kingdom of Sorrow. So Klonoa, along with the help of Lolo and Popka, go on a journey to save the day. When making a video game sequel, a lot of times the franchise has to expand upon the ideas of the original. And I think it does that pretty well. We technically learn what a dream traveler is. Not really that well, but my understanding, a dream traveler is a being that's destined to protect the dream world from nightmares and total destruction. And the form Klonoa takes is actually us traveling through dreamscapes to protect the balance of the dream worlds. We also learn some very interesting things about the Wind Ring as well, such as its ability to store items and people within it, as Lolo and Popka, and another item we'll be talking about in the game, we see from time to time enter and exit the Wind Ring. Though we did also see this with Hupao and Klonoa, it actually makes now a lot more sense of why Hupao is capable of doing it. We also learn that Klonoa needs a being from the dream world in order to fire wind bullets. At least in the mainline games, but yeah, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. And that's where Lolo comes in, who is actually a priestess in this world, well, priestess in training, and after helping her, we actually make her become a priestess full-time, and give her the mission along with Klonoa to actually save the world. And Lolo is my favorite thing about this game. We see Lolo wants to become a priestess, and she does succeed thanks to Klonoa, but we see she isn't the most competent person to save the world. And we see that growth within the fourth world of the game. She feels useless and feels as if she doesn't deserve the title of priestess, and admits to her mistakes. And the bond that she develops with Klonoa throughout this entire journey, I think is more authentic than with Hupao back in the first game. She starts off as this really helpful, friendly character who feels incompetent, and then she shows that she has what it takes to really help out in certain situations. It's understandable why she's so popular, and it's probably the reason why she reappears in future incarnations of the Klonoa universe. But before we talk about the world of Lunatea and the characters within it, I should probably explain more of the gameplay. As stated before, the gameplay is fairly the same, and the enemies you see actually do return. Of course, like things like Moose, Teton, etc. But there also exist some brand new enemies that are exclusive into the world of Lunatea, such as the Keton, which are a superior version of the Teton, as when you pick them up, if you press the jump button repetitively, they actually do a helicopter jump until you throw them, or when they explode on their own. There's also the Erbil, who give Klonoa an extra jolt in his jumping ability, and I mean that quite literally. There's the Jetamo, which makes Klonoa skyrocket in the air, and trust me, this is really fun. And lastly, there is the Liquori. The Liquori I find very interesting, and a lot of people consider the worst enemy in the Klonoa series, mostly because of its unique gimmick. When you pick up a Liquori and throw it at enemies, it actually comes back at you like a boomerang, though they change colors. That's mostly a big deal because one of the things that will be blocking your path are these specific colored crystals that you need a specific Liquori to hit it with. Sometimes it leads to some of the most confusing platforming in the game, but honestly it's not that bad for me. All you have to do is just really think of which person to hit first and then find a way to navigate through the level using that specific enemy. It usually goes from yellow, blue to red. I really like the new things they do add in Klonoa. One of which is his new outfit, which goes from his classic red belt around his neck and red pants, this time around being fully blue. Another interesting thing is when Klonoa actually does extra jumps, he actually says new words besides wahoo, only when you do chain jumps. And lastly, one of the newest mechanics within the game is the hoverboard. The hoverboard you actually find within the second world of the game. However, Popka manages to steal the hoverboard so Klonoa could use it to traverse the world. I find these levels really fun and entertaining, but sadly, one of the things that makes this not that great is because they're very short, lasting up to 3 minutes. The Klonoa series is fairly simple with its platforming levels, and yeah, I did mention that in the first game that it usually takes about a few hours to beat the game, but Lunatea's Veil actually did expand upon the platforming levels. Some people actually hate it, as some people state that it could take up to 20 minutes to beat an entire level, and personally, I don't think that's a bad thing. When making sequels that expand upon the gameplay, I think it's a good thing that it expands upon its levels as long as it does something different and unique with each level. And I think Klonoa 2 does that really well. Of course, you still get the classic collectibles like the jewels, which if you collect 100, you'll get an extra life. There's the extra life coins. Though in the last game, you had to rescue 6 citizens and bubbles with unique symbols based off the different species within the world of Phantomile. Instead, when you pop a bubble, that actually makes a living little doll appear that actually appear from a runaway circus. And by collecting as many as you can, you actually unlock some really cool collectibles, like concept art, like which I couldn't get, and a secret bonus level. The world of Lunatea is vast and very interesting. Though there are only 14 levels within the game, 15 if you count the bonus one, there are a total of 5 different kingdoms within the world of Lunatea. There's the Kingdom of Tranquility, La Lacusha, a peaceful land of nature and home of the priestesses, just like Lolo. The Kingdom of Joy, Joliant, an entire kingdom made into a theme park full of never-ending fun. The Kingdom of Discord, Volk, a factory-based city that seems to be in never-ending war. The Kingdom of Indecision, Miramira, is one giant museum out in the middle of a winter wonderland, probably in reference to another Klonoa game during the production of Lunatea's Veil. Hint, hint. Also, it has the best song in the Klonoa series. Lastly, the Kingdom of Sorrows, Euponia, the lost kingdom that is said to bring Lunatea to ruin. But before that, I should probably mention the rest of the story. When trying to ring all 4 bells to get the 4 elements within the kingdoms, stopping us on our travels is the sky pirate Liarina, I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, and her little sidekick Tat. We actually learned that Liarina was formerly a priest in training, but left her training to find true strength. In order to do so, she manages to make a copy of Klonoa's wind ring in order to awaken the lost kingdom of sorrow by ringing the fabled 5th bell. Ironically enough, where we began the game, we fail to stop her from ringing the bell, and the entire ocean disappears, leading towards the kingdom of sorrow. Weird that you find it in the ocean. You could say it was hiding in Lunatea's Veil? I'll shut up now. We take chase and Lyrina gets corrupted by either the replica ring or the elements of the bells, and we decide to take her down. We save her life and she realizes her mistake and helps us to the Kingdom of Sorrow. And trust me to say, these last few levels put your platforming to the test, adding that extra difficulty curve that I've been really missing in the first game. But inside, we meet the King of Sorrow, who turns out was actually Baguji, and the voice Klonoa has been hearing throughout the game, asking for help. He states that ignoring sorrow is Lunatea's greatest sin and wants to spread it throughout the dream world, thus taking us to our final boss fight with the King of Sorrow. It's a two-phaser with the first half on the hoverboard, and the second half being surprisingly easier than the first half. Even though we win the fight, Klonoa doesn't defeat the King of Sorrow, but instead saves him from it, the very thing he summoned Klonoa to do. Klonoa rings the final bell and creates harmony throughout Lunatea. And in the credits, we see that the King of Sorrows was resurrected as a baby. Aww. In the end, we see Klonoa, Lolo, and Popka just watching the ocean, and Lolo decides to continue studying harder to become a proper priestess, even giving up that title, showing that Lolo has grown quite a lot since meeting Klonoa. But sadly, like the first game, Klonoa has to say farewell to his new friends, and everything gets so emotional as Lolo hugs Klonoa, crying for him not to go. But unlike the first game, Klonoa leaves on his own terms, but not without saying some heartwarming final words, showing he's matured so much after the first game, and has taken the responsibilities of a dream traveler. Of course, just like in the last game, there is some endgame stuff, and by collecting those little voodoo dolls, you unlock concept art of the game, as well as a secret level and a timed boss rush, which actually got into the Wiimake of Door to Phantomile. Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil improves on the level design and develops more of what made Door to Phantomile so investing. Though levels can take longer for some, I think the game has the perfect balance for those new and those returning to the series. The game was well regarded and praised for its gameplay at the time, but for unknown reasons, Namco never made a Klonoa 3 after 20 years of silence for the main titles. I mean, they did try to bring him back a few years later, and there were even plans for Lunatea's Veil to get a remake as well. But we already know how that turned out. Luckily, Klonoa will no longer be lost to obscurity, as Namco is finally remaking both mainline games on multiple platforms, even learning from the mistakes of better advertising, and there's nothing that's better advertising than a Nintendo Direct if you ask me. I actually consider Klonoa 2 to be one of the best games on the PlayStation 2, and I'm really happy I actually have a physical copy of this game. I only found for $30, and I'm really excited that people are finally going to experience a title that most have probably never played. You know, unless they wanted to pull out a loan. Though this was the last mainline title of the Klonoa series, there's still one more video on this Klonoa retrospective, so tune in next time as I talk about the final Klonoa retrospective video on the Klonoa spin-off games, cause trust me, Klonoa gets even weirder. Hey guys, this is the Unlucky AngelStar, and here we are yet again talking about Klonoa, as we're finally going to take a look at the last remaining thing of this Klonoa retrospective, and that is his spin-off appearances. If you've been following me on this channel for a month now, you probably know I've been actually doing a retrospective on the Klonoa series, and we just finished our rundown on the mainline series of the Klonoa franchise, both Klonoa Door to Phantomile and Klonoa 2 Lunatea's Veil. Now note when I say mainline games, that's mostly because I consider all these titles from Klonoa spin-offs, as in they are non-canonical to the mainline Klonoa franchise, even though they tried their best to find a way to interconnect these worlds one another. And you thought Kingdom Hearts timeline was confusing? Before I should mention the main games, I should also mention the other appearances Klonoa has made over the years. Klonoa was actually a playable character in games like Alpha Racer 3, along with his hoverboard, MotoGP, where he's riding a motorcycle, Family Tennis Advance, Smash Court 3, Baseball and Pro Yaku Famitsu, along with other forgotten Namco characters. He also appears in the arcade game World Kicks. He's also playable along with another character we'll be talking about, along with the moves and Joka in the game Namco X Capcom exclusive to Japan. In the game Namco High, a dating sim featuring Namco characters, Lolo is one of the dateable characters, and she's become a bit of a tsundere, and his series has made a handful of cameos in games like Soul Calibur 5, Tekken 7, and especially throughout the Tales series. But other than that, these are the last few games of the Klonoa series. I should probably mention this before we actually get started. A lot of these games are regional exclusive, so there's not really a proper way for me to play these legally, so I finally learned how to emulate games. Well, most of them. All the footage you're seeing, it has been me playing most of these games with an emulator to the best of my abilities. I should also let you know my gameplay of Door to Phantomile was also emulated, because owning an official copy is, well, expensive, and I don't have that kind of cash to throw in. That's why I'm actually really lucky to actually own the Wiimake. So let's begin this look back at one of the most iconic Klonoa games that a lot of people have probably played. Oh, scratch that, I made a mistake. It's actually the most obscure Klonoa game no one's ever played. Klonoa Moonlight Museum. Klonoa Moonlight Museum was released in 1999 and was both developed and published by Namco, more specifically a special team that was made for the idea of these Klonoa games, aka Klonoa Works, an entire studio dedicated to making Klonoa games. The reason I state this is because Yoshizawa returned as a director for this game while working on both Moonlight Museum and Lunatea's Veil at the same time, which I've already made references to back in my Lunatea's Veil video if you haven't seen it. What makes this game a little more weirder than the others is the fact that it was released on something called the Wonder Swan Color. What's a Wonder Swan, you ask? I'm not entirely sure myself. All I can gather is that it's a Game Boy knockoff that was really popular in Japan, but still couldn't beat the sales of, the Game Boy. But considering this game came out before Lunatea's Veil, what would this game be about, honestly? Would you believe if I told you it was a prequel to Door to Phantomile? Yeah, me neither. I told you the timeline would get weird. The game begins with Klonoa and his friend Hupao coming across a young girl crying, who tells them that the moon just suddenly disappeared. Apparently, it was divided into fragments and stolen by a mysterious group of artists that reside in the nearby Moonlit Museum. Determined to help, the duo rush off to the museum's entrance, and once they come inside, they're greeted by a painter named Pico who traps them inside a piece of artwork. So, Klonoa and Hupao must fight their way to escape through the 5 worlds within the museum itself before finding the source of all their troubles and restoring the moon to the sky. Now, I'm generally going to be honest here. Though I did emulate a lot of these games, ironically enough, Moonlight Museum is the only one I couldn't emulate. I didn't really know how to actually emulate Moonlight Museum because I'm still new to this emulation thing. So to make up for it, I'm actually using footage and gameplay I actually looked at by the YouTube channel The Shelly. So go check out their channel if you want to see the entire playthrough yourself. The game was emulated into English, but as mentioned before, the Wonder Swan was exclusive to Japan, so this was another one of those Klonoa games that never did leave out of the country of origin. But from what I could gather from the gameplay, it just plays like, well, Klonoa. Walking, hovering, picking up and throwing enemies. Typical Klonoa stuff. I know that's not much to really go off of, but that is what I kind of see. But the gameplay is vastly different from the mainline Klonoa games. As most Klonoa games, you have to go from the beginning of a specific level all the way to the very end. Instead, you actually have to navigate through the entire level using Klonoa's platforming to its best of its abilities, what I'm calling a puzzle platformer. So you have to use specific enemies or items to actually navigate through the entire level to reach the very end, but not without collecting a few collectibles. Specifically, you have to collect 3 moon pieces before you can actually exit a level. There are also 30 jewels that you can collect, which are no longer used for lives, and are more for collectibles and bragging rights. What's also really interesting is there's not really any bosses in this game. It might have to do with the Wonder Swan's limited hardware, but I could be wrong. But it was actually really interesting to learn about Moonlight Museum. It's basically a Klonoa game as obscure as Klonoa himself. It's a pretty neat thing to know about, but of course a physical copy and the console itself would go for quite a hefty price. Sadly, emulation is the best way to play this game if you can find it. But there is also another way to actually play Moonlight Museum, just in a vastly different way, leading us to the title that I was actually hinting towards, that I'm pretty sure most people have kind of played, that being Klonoa Empire of Dreams. Klonoa Empire of Dreams released in July of 2001 on the Game Boy Advance. It was published and developed by Namco, but it also had a secondary developer known as Now Production, a studio who's actually worked with many big-name companies like Nintendo, Sega, Taito, Hudson, Capcom, and more, with their most recent development being Deadly Premonition 2. Why does this game keep coming up on my list? Oh, whatever, I should probably mention the story. So one day, Klonoa wakes up from a dream, but apparently he gets arrested because dreams are illegal to have in the kingdom he's currently in. So the king asks Klonoa to prove the worth of dreams and solve the issues going around within the kingdom. So Klonoa and Hupao are traversing the entire world to prove that dreams are not just some silly little thing that people have when they're sleeping. It seems kind of impossible to do unless you know a way to make them not dream. Doesn't really matter. Now, I did mention that you don't really have to play Moonlight Museum. That's mostly because Empire of Dreams is basically a remake of Moonlight Museum, just with a different story. The gameplay itself is practically the same in every way. Heck, even the collectibles that you have to use to get to the level are the exact same. Though I'm not sure if the games are level by level creations, with some additional bells and whistles. But there are some additional levels that are actually in this game, such as the return of the hoverboard, but this time in 2D, but it's not as fun as the 3D ones in my general opinion. You mostly just use these to actually collect gems within the level, and that's kind of it. There's also bonus auto-scrolling levels, and I hate these. Not many people are really big fans of auto-scrollers, but I could probably give you a good reason why I don't really like Klonoa with an auto-scroller. The speed of within the auto-scrolling is either too fast, or the screen in the Game Boy is a little too small to actually make me go as fast as I should. So there are moments where I feel like I kind of screwed up. This is also a big problem considering the fact that you can't really go backwards just to pick up something or to actually save yourself from certain situations. I do like the idea that Klonoa is one of the few puzzle platformers in gaming that is actually pretty enjoyable, even though it doesn't really follow any of the mainline games. That's why I consider it a non-canon timeline. I mean, after defeating the first monster in the world, it turns out that monster was actually a kangaroo named Chipple, who actually had a dream of becoming stronger, only to then realize that, well, his dream became a reality, or more of a nightmare. And throughout the Empire, we see other people get corrupted by something that eventually takes us back to the castle, thinking it was the king, but it was actually this one guy we see for one screen, who clearly looked evil. We saved the day, we proved that dreams were not a bad thing, only to figure out that it was all the king's dream. Hence he's named the Empire of Dreams. Oh look, just like the game. Klonoa Empire of Dreams is a unique way to bring Klonoa onto a handheld, and it embraces the idea of Klonoa being a puzzle platformer really entertaining. The game was not just good enough to get a sequel in the year 2002, but also 2 other games within the same year. Yeah, 2002 was potentially the year of Klonoa, as 3 Klonoa games came out within the same year, but the distribution of the games was very convoluted and confusing. We'll get to that later. Let's first talk about Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament. Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament released on the Game Boy Advance on August of 2002, and developed and published again by Namco and Now Production, taking place right after Empire Dreams, I believe, even though Hupao is not even in this game, as we see Klonoa defeat another dose of Nightmare Fuel, and these get sent an invitation. Sadly, it's not to Smash Brothers, but instead to the Dream Champ Tournament, where many warriors throughout the Dream World compete to be the best of the best, held by a cyborg man named Garland, who's clearly the bad guy here. Also, Klonoa actually reunites with Lolo, Popka, and Chipple? The same Chipple from Empire Dreams? Ooh, and even got a redesign that's actually really cool. Good for him. Joka is also here too, and apparently both him and Klonoa don't seem to recognize one another. Odd. That might be a situation, you know, not being canonical to the mainline game. This is also where we're introduced to the newest character of the series, named Gantz, or Gunts. It's more of a pick your poison situation, who's an angsty looking dog with guns, which is making the Sonic the Hedgehog comparisons even more, you know, comparable. Though he may look and act like Shadow the Hedgehog, he's more like Knuckles, as he comes across as rude, but tends to be a nice guy when you get to know him. And yeah, no surprise, this plays exactly like Empire Dreams, but they've actually added some new changes, one of which is adding some of the enemies that were a part of Klonoa's 2, Lunatea's Veil, to better solve puzzles, mostly the Thunder Jumpers and the one that everyone hates. The hoverboards also got a new 3D design and are better than the last version, though I can't say that about the hit detection. And levels actually have a bonus collectible in Gears, and also a ranking system depending on how much damage you took, how much items you collected, and how fast you beat the level, which actually gets you some cool low poly art. Now, what I'm saying here is actually a lot of great positives about this game, and yeah, there are a lot of good things about Dream Champ Tournament. Unfortunately, the game gets far more difficult and annoying after the third world. Let me state this, the third world has some underwater gimmick levels that are borderline awful to sit through, and some puzzles involve a whole lot of backtracking. Boss fights are also some of my least favorite in the Klonoa series, because it's basically a race to the finish sort of situation, but you don't really get to face your opponents head on. You're either just facing a giant monster or navigating the entire level to find a specific item in order to get to the next area, with the worst bosses in my opinion being against Gantz, which by the way you don't actually get to see his in-game model besides in the cutscenes, and of course the fight against Garland. Especially that final third act, that was terrible. Speaking of Garland, it turns out he's actually turning all the loser fighters into gears for his giant machine in order to take over the dream worlds. But Klonoa, of course, takes on that challenge and defeats him. Garland gets arrested because one of the combatants was actually a member of the Dream Police. Klonoa earns the Dream Champ trophy, and Gantz runs away with the money. And everyone's cool in the end. Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament is probably the most challenging game in the series. So much so that I think I died the most in this game than I did with any other Klonoa game combined. Now, just because a game has a challenge doesn't mean it's always going to be good. I'd say the first half of the game is very entertaining, but it's the second half that gets really tedious and obnoxious, especially with its puzzle gameplay. But if you're really dedicated to the Klonoa series like I am, it's still a must-get. And both Empire of Dreams and Dream Champ Tournament you can still get on the Wii U eShop. Just get it now before it's gone forever, and they're like $7. Even though I still use the emulator, I still have the digital version of these on my Wii U. So I might play those again on a stream sometime in the future. Now, the last two games in the Klonoa series are the epitome of Klonoa's weirdness. For starters, the first game we're going to be talking about is also the last game on the PlayStation 1, and it's none other than Klonoa Beach Volleyball. I'm being serious here. Klonoa Beach Volleyball released in April 2002 on the PlayStation 1 exclusively in Japan and Europe, and was published by Sony and Namco and developed by Namco. There's actually no story to this whatsoever on account of, it's a multiplayer game. All I can generally say is I think everyone's just entering a tag team volleyball tournament just for fun, and the point of the game is to play beach volleyball. First to get 10 points actually wins. If you're familiar with the rules of volleyball, you can only touch the ball up to 3 times. Considering it's a multiplayer game, it's actually one of the first Klonoa games where you can actually play as different characters from the series. You can play as Klonoa, Lolo, Popka, Joka, Lerina, Tat, Chipple, and one of the best characters, Moo. Or specifically, his name is Heart Moo, so he's fairly different from the other Moos. You can also unlock 2 different versions of Garland, Gantz, who's the first character you actually unlocked, who made his first debut in this game of all things, because Dream Champ Tournament didn't release until August, and Nahatum? You mean final boss Klonoa Door to Phantomile Nahatum. Wow. You sure did get a downgrade. Lastly, I should probably talk about the gameplay, and that's mostly because that's the major thing about this game. So by playing over 10 minutes of tutorial, you actually learn how to serve the ball with square, pass it around with the X button, and to use your special button, which if you can use really well can get you up to 9 points if the ball has landed all over the playing field. And you can even control the aim of the ball with the analog stick. The gameplay can be a little complicated at first, but I'm not gonna lie when I say I actually had a lot of fun playing Klonoa Beach Volleyball of all things. Of course, I only did one playthrough of the campaign mode with Moo and Chipple, who also happens to be here. Namco really must have loved Chipple. But I actually learned after beating the campaign mode, only the team captain gets the ending. So if you actually want to beat the whole game 100%, that means you have to play the campaign a total of 12 times. That can be a little crazy in all honesty, but I honestly recommend playing it a few times until you unlock Nahatum, so that way you have all the characters and then play with friends. That is if you live in Europe or Japan, or if you emulated it like I did. It's generally amazing that the only multiplayer game of the Klonoa series is Klonoa Beach Volleyball. I'm kind of disappointed that there were no other Klonoa spin-offs like a kart racer or a party game. But considering that most Mario Party clones are kind of bad, I think we dodged a bullet there. But now I have saved what's potentially the best for last. Or the weirdest for last, as this Klonoa game is its own canon entirely. The last Klonoa game is borderline weird on its gameplay, design, and story. This game is so weird, it's one of the only Klonoa games that not actually have Wahoo in the title. So let me show you the last game of the Klonoa series, Kaze no Klonoa Densetsu no Star Medal, or Klonoa Heroes, The Legend of the Star Medal. Klonoa Heroes Legend of the Star Medal released in December of 2002 and was developed and published yet again by Namco, and was also exclusive to Japan. Considering this was exclusive to Japan, I was lucky enough to actually find a English patched version that worked. For the most part. Normally when we think of Klonoa, everyone automatically thinks of, puzzle platforming. So it comes to my surprise as Klonoa Heroes is a top-down action RPG. Of course, we do have to talk about the story of the game, and I'll try my best. as Klonoa dreams of wanting to become a hero, and the only way to show that you're a true hero is if you have a hero medal. And after running into a few memorable characters like Popka Lolo and your no longer dead grandpa. Also, don't forget Chipple. We all love Chipple. You run into Gantz, who steals the flower that Klonoa was going to give to Lolo, and he fights him for it, leading him to want to become stronger and to become a true hero. After defeating Gantz, we give Lolo the flower, and we set off on our journey to get stronger in order to become a true hero. This is also where we get the most character development with Gantz, as yet again he goes for that tough guy persona, but he's actually secretly nice. We also learn that he's not a real big fan of boats. I like him already. There's also a third character that's exclusive to this game entirely, named Pango, a giant armadillo who throws bombs, who I sadly couldn't get to see footage of on account of, well, I'll explain later. So a top-down action RPG is actually how it sounds like, having a top-down adventure similar to Legend of Zelda, with shooting or hack-and-slash gameplay that gives you EXP and stat boosts, similar to, well, a lot of action RPGs. While Klonoa normally used the wind ring for platforming, this time we actually see him use it as a weapon, which kind of goes against the idea of the original game, but I'm not gonna lie when I said I had a really interesting time. Not to mention, the wind ring is also capable of changing into different weapon types, like a blade, a mallet, and many other more, which I sadly couldn't see. You actually get 2 different energy waves, either blue or red, that does damage to specific enemy types. You also get a super attack later on in the game for specific characters, if you have the gear that lets you use special attacks. And once when you get characters like Gantz and Pango, you can actually switch between them on the fly. When it comes to collectibles, obviously for an action RPG, you can collect and equip items to help you on your journey. Though the most useful item I've learned to collect is health. You get hurt real easily in this game, and when you die, you have to go all the way back from the beginning of the level you started, and that can get pretty annoying. With most of the Klonoa games, I played all the way to the end. Even with Moonlight Museum, I watched the entire playthrough. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that with Klonoa Heroes. Now, the reason why I didn't beat this game, one, it's an RPG, so it's gonna probably take a few dozen hours for me to beat it, and secondly, the emulator was not translating everything I needed for the game. So when I got to a specific underwater level that I needed a specific item to equip, I think, I didn't know what I needed, and I got soft locked there. Hence why I never got a chance to meet Pango. But from what I played, Klonoa Heroes is actually really fun, and I'm kind of disappointed that this was a Japanese exclusive. In fact, that's actually one of the weirdest things about these last 3 Klonoa games. You had 3 Klonoa games come out within the same year, but only Dream Champ Tournament was the only one that was available everywhere, including the US. While Beach Volleyball was only exclusive to Europe and Japan, and Klonoa Heroes was a Japanese exclusive. So if you only lived in Japan, you got to play all 3 of these games. While in Europe, you only got 2 of them, and the US of A got only 1 title. Beach Volleyball, understandable. The PlayStation already outlived its life, and we were already on the PS2 era. But a Klonoa RPG would actually be really kind of cool, but I'm kind of surprised that a lot of people never got this version of the game. And just like the Klonoa series, most of these games were forgotten to obscurity. Also, I should mention this, why was the Wii version of Klonoa also available on the Wii U eShop? I mean, yeah, the game didn't sell well, but if they put it on the Wii U eShop, maybe it could have had some resale value for the Wii U. I mean, I could be wrong, but that would also mean that all these Klonoa games wouldn't be so expensive. Luckily, this isn't the end of Klonoa, as for the third final time I'm mentioning it, Klonoa is finally getting his much-needed comeback that everyone has been waiting for with the Phantasy Reverie series. As much as I really enjoyed the mainline Klonoa games, I would be kind of disappointed if the other Klonoa titles never got a re-release, and looking back at all these games, a lot of them are fairly enjoyable. The mainline ones are still the best Klonoa has ever been. Empire of Dreams is also a very entertaining handheld version of this game. Moonlight Museum seems like a really cool collectible item. Klonoa Heroes was a fairly enjoyable story that's non-canon to the major timelines, and as much as I wasn't really a big fan of Dream Champ Tournament, I still thought it was really enjoyable, and it actually had some nice visuals. Phantasy Reverie series is probably going to be the comeback Klonoa has been needing, and who knows, maybe they'll even port the GBA versions on the Switch. Or better yet, even add them as hidden collectibles in Phantasy Reverie. There's a lot of interesting things about Klonoa himself as a character and throughout his development history. Not just with his video games, but also the types of comics that also exist. There exists a Klonoa manga and a webcomic that tries to interconnect the Klonoa universe into one, which sadly got discontinued after it got really good. But you know what? There's actually one more thing about Klonoa I actually really want to talk about, that I'm pretty certain even the most hardcore Klonoa fans don't even know exist. Though this may be the end of the Klonoa retrospective Retrospective in Gaming, I've got one more Klonoa video for you all. So tune into that, and thanks for watching. To those who've been watching my channel for over a month now, you probably know that I've done an entire retrospective on the Klonoa series of games. But those who don't know, Klonoa is a 2D platformer about a little cat creature named Klonoa and his adventures throughout the dream worlds. I highly recommend checking out my entire retrospective of the series. I'll do an entire full version sometime in the future, and there is a lot to talk about before the Phantasy Reverie series. But even the most hardcore of Klonoa fans don't even know about this obscure media that a lot of people don't know about. Did you know that Klonoa almost had a movie? Let's talk about it. Klonoa the movie was announced back in July of 2016. The film was originally going to be written by manga creator Hitoshi Ariga. Well, manga creator with apostrophes. But he has written a few handful of adaptations such as The Big O and, most prominently, the Mega Man series. And the studio behind the development of the film is a newcomer studio known as Henshin Incorporated. Henshin was founded back in 2014 by anime producer and entrepreneur Rob Pereda, who has quite the impressive resume, being North American CEO and global CSO at the Viewster, Vice President Business Development Network Strategy Office at Bandai Namco Games, Vice President to Licensing of Crunchyroll, and Licensing Specialist at Capcom. He was originally established as entertainment consultancy and investment firm of Henshin, and now focuses exclusively on developing premium content. And the Klonoa movie may have been their first big production, and their only production. This is kind of a big deal, especially considering that Rob Pereda has also worked as a producer for many different projects, including an anime called Wonder Momo, a few anime-based games that I was genuinely surprised actually existed, like Bravo Man, Mappy, as well as the visual novel game Namco High, and even produced the Netflix original series Seis Manos. His recent credit was also as an editorial and publishing for Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. Whether that's a good thing is up to you. Though it wasn't just Pereda and Henshin who were also part of this big project. Ash Paulson, former member of GameXplain and creator of Good Vibes Gaming, was the associate producer of the film, and they even brought in Hideo Yoshizawa, the creator of Klonoa. But it's unsure what his role was within the film's development. So much about this film is completely unknown that there's generally not much to really say about the film, except the fact that it did exist. Heck, there's not really much information about the plot itself. The plot of the film was shrouded in mystery, and some claimed it was a retelling of Door to Phantomile. But Rob Pereda actually did spoke in an interview about the movie, and it's an entirely original plot. Though considering there was no actual film footage to actually be found by Henshin, sometimes projects can be considered fake or speculation or rumor. The only real concrete evidence of the movie's existence is a handful of concept art by the creator, showing Klonoa in a unique design, which is based off Jubilee from the X-Men series, showing that Klonoa was going for an original story. But sadly, 3 years later, on January 5th of 2019, Klonoa movie was officially cancelled, with generally no real information whatsoever about what happened. Until a few days later by Katsuhiro Harada, the known producer of the Tekken series, actually tweeting about the movie. He tells that Klonoa's IP being originally owned by Bandai Namco Entertainment, were actually asked about the Klonoa film situation. Though, believe it or not, Bandai Namco themselves don't even know why it was cancelled. That's because the only real information about the movie would have come from Henshin themselves. Henshin was also an American-based studio. They were given the permission by Namco to actually make a film adaptation of the series, and they even stated it was in pre-production. Bandai Namco gave Henshin a deadline to show their plans of production and revenue and publicity for the film, but after 2 years, there wasn't anything besides a cancellation notification by Henshin themselves. The news itself was actually a surprise to even the writer of the film, Harada. Even doing some research on Henshin themselves, I generally couldn't find anything about the company, so for a desperate act, I decided to actually go to the source itself. So I left it an email, and I've heard nothing since. But if I do hear any information whatsoever in the future, I'll let you guys know on my Twitter. Considering there isn't really much to go on for the Klonoa film within its development, the rest of this video will have to be pure speculation. One of the obvious situations is making an original film based off a popular IP. Though Yoshizawa was in the production of the film, it's unsure whether or not Yoshizawa really did have any assistance with the film whatsoever. Not to mention, Klonoa's story in general is fairly confusing if you add up all the spin-offs into the main storyline. But when when it comes to original stories based off video games, well, if you've seen the Monster Hunter movie, you can kind of tell those are never good, as video game movies often are given a bad reputation, with the films that were released during Klonoa's production being Resident Evil: The Final Chapter, Tomb Raider, and Rampage, even though Tomb Raider and Rampage were fairly okay films. Not to mention, if the film were to release between 2019 and 2020, it would have had to compete with Detective Pikachu and the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Henshin Inc. were a fairly new company in the film industry, and the decision to adapt a loved yet forgotten IP seemed difficult for them, and it was potentially stuck in production hell, leading to, well, the sudden cancellation. And we've never seen anything since from Henshin Incorporated. Of all the obscure information I could find about the Klonoa series, I think this is probably the most obscure thing about Klonoa in general. If Bandai Namco were interested in adapting a Klonoa movie, I think a Japanese animation studio would have been the best choice to make a Klonoa film. Probably a studio that was behind the Dragon Quest film and or Lupin III, the first film, with stunning 3D visuals. Imagine it, a Klonoa movie that looked just like the games, with the emotional storytelling of the series. But sadly, we can only think of what could have been. Maybe with a proper revival of the series, aka Phantasy Reverie, maybe a proper Klonoa film can happen someday. But then again, we can only dream. Yeah, that was pretty cheesy. Klonoa Phantasy Reverie. It is finally here, and I'm talking about it a few weeks after it released. Well, after finally finishing Dragalia month, and you're probably tired of me waiting to talk about it, so let's finally get to it. Klonoa Phantasy Reverie is an HD remake of the original Klonoa Door to Phantomile and Klonoa 2 Lunatia's Veil. Though Door to Phantomile got a remake just called Klonoa on the Wii, this is the first time Klonoa 2 ever got a re-release outside the PS2 version. There were talks of a potential GameCube and even Xbox version, but sadly those were cancelled for unknown reasons. There was also talk of a Klonoa 2 remake, but that's only if Klonoa for the Wii actually succeeded, which by the way, it didn't. But now, Bandai Namco has finally tried again during its 25th anniversary. And the game released on July 8th, 2022 in the US, well, I think we shouldn't be just thanking Bandai Namco for the creation of this game. Sure, they did publish and develop it, and they even showed off their brand new logo for the company, which I'm gonna generally say is not my favorite. But I also want to thank the company Monkeycraft, who's actually handled remakes in the past, including Katamari Damacy Reroll, Wonder Boy, Asha, and Monster World. I've heard it's good, I've never played any of the Wonder Boy games. They also worked on a handheld version of the River City game, and a video game adaptation of Little Witch Demia, which I've heard is pretty mixed reviews. Now, in all honesty, I've already talked about the story of the entire games previously, so during my free time when the game finally released, I decided to play the entirety of the Phantasy Reverie series, but I'll be only using the first few hours of gameplay I recorded. One, so I can keep this review as spoiler-free as I can, for those who are new to this channel. Also, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other videos. But if you want my entire opinions on these games as a whole, considering these are still the same games, my opinion on said games still hasn't changed. But with that out of the way, yeah, this is definitely Klonoa Door to Phantomile and Klonoa 2 Lunatia's Veil. But there is a lot of interesting things about this game. The games are exactly the same, but there are some additional bells and whistles. You can play the game in 3 different difficulties. Easy mode for first-time players, where the wind bullet actually goes a little farther, and you get additional health points. Normal mode is actually the original HP mount from the original games, and if you beat the main game, you can unlock hard mode, which only gives you 1 hit and 2 lives. So good luck with that if you want to do that. Also early on, they do tell you about a co-op mode, which actually originated in Lunatia's Veil that I didn't even know existed. They also brought it into Door to Phantomile, adding a little more usefulness to characters like Hupao and Popka. But instead of it being like co-op play like Mario 3D World or Mario Galaxy 2, all it really does is just give you an extra jump. So all you really have to do is just plug in an extra controller and use that as an extra button. Even though these games are remakes, they actually do reuse some assets from the original game, more specifically some of the audio within the game. Sort of. Klonoa 2's audio is exactly the same from the original, though it's kind of weird that Door to Phantomile has automatic text movement. Lunatia's Veil, you have to press a button from time to time, though they do reuse assets from Lunatia's Veil. For Door to Phantomile, they actually reuse the assets from the Nintendo Wii version, which actually makes a lot of sense considering some trees in the background don't really look like trees. Also, the audio mixing is a little weird, as it sounds like classic Klonoa from the PlayStation 1 audio was used, and then for some reasons there's a more modern take where it doesn't sound as scratchy. Even though they do upgrade from the Wii base assets, considering it's a lot easier probably to port into an HD version, the English voice acting in the Wii version is not available whatsoever. everyone still speaks the language that is apparently known as Phantomile, which I am probably pronouncing incorrectly. Also, this is my personal opinion, but I don't like the term Phantomile as a language. The reason I don't really like Phantomile as much is because it isn't really a language that can be properly translated. Different characters have different ways of speaking to one another. As Klonoa talks, he always has a different way of saying wahoo. Popka always sounds like a dog, and Hupao always talks about pee-pee. The only exception when they're actually speaking in Phantomile is when they're actually saying other people's names. It's kind of similar how Banjo-Kazooie uses its speaking in its gameplay style. Everyone speaks a type of gibberish, but they have a unique way of speaking it depending on the person. Which is also ironic considering Banjo-Kazooie came out a year after Klonoa. Even though there is a place called Lunatea, which is a different dream world entirely, also speaks this supposed same language, even though there's no interconnection with these two worlds whatsoever, other than the fact they are dreamscape. So would it be then called Lunatean? But personally, I actually have a better term to actually call this. I think the official name should be called Dream Language, or the Language of Dreams. Think about it. Considering these are worlds based off dreams, it makes sense that each person has a unique speaking dialogue, and it adds a little more emphasis on the this is all a dreamscape. So it does sound like even though they're speaking gibberish, it's also understandable why they speak this language. This is how people would talk in a dream world, apparently. Now that I said it out loud, I'm kind of curious what would happen if you got rid of the speech bubbles within the Klonoa games. Would it make the game more creative in its storytelling, or would it just be confusing? But either way, I think Dream Language is the best term to use. Speaking of different changes, if you actually go into the options menu, you can actually change the filter of the gameplay to make Door to Phantomile almost look like the original game. Heck, you can even make Lunatea's Veil look like it was originally released on the PlayStation 1. Though I honestly would prefer that 100%ing both games would let you play the original version, similar to what Medieval's remaster did, or at least give us a way to play beach volleyball again. Though one thing I will generally say I'm not a big fan of is the additional perks that they gave you. More specifically, the Collector's Pack. Though if you automatically download the game digitally, you automatically get a free costume, which lets Klonoa dress as a Moo. There are also some additional costumes, including the Prince from Katamari, and a Pac-Man hat, even though he already has Pac-Man on his hat. You also unlock a video game soundtrack and art book, which does sound kinda cool, but I honestly wouldn't recommend it, especially considering they're charging $20 for this type of collection, and if you got it for Steam, you couldn't really keep the audio whatsoever. Probably do some copyright or some stuff. Plus, if you beat the endgame bonus content, you automatically unlock a sound test. And something I made a mistake on my Lunatea's Veil video, if you collect 150 jewels, which is actually much harder than it sounds, you actually unlock the concept art in the game, which they actually made an HD iteration of, which I will give mad respect for. Also, it makes the Collector's Pack more obsolete than it sounds, and considering that the Door to Phantomile is a Wiimake, though they did get rid of some of the original charm that was in the Wiimake. Heck, you can't even dress up as the Wii version of Klonoa, unfortunately. I mean, I am happy that they did choose the original PlayStation 1 design, but at least give me some options, I'm just saying. But one of the things I definitely hated about Phantasy Reverie is the fact that the US was the only country to not get a physical release. Why can't we get nice things? You could do a physical and a digital, but you can't do selective physicals. I would like it if you have a physical and a digital option. But I always hated that whenever it's something for the US, the answer is usually a full-fledged no. I did download this digitally on my Switch, mostly because I didn't want to pay extra shipping for a physical release. But considering this is Klonoa's 25th anniversary, I kinda wish they did a little more with it as well. It's kinda cool that there are physical releases of this game, but I wish they also did some cool limited edition ones too. You know, maybe something with an official art book, some cute little Klonoa stickers, a Popka, or even a Moo plushie, or even a replica ring for you to hold like Klonoa. The best example I can give is this really cool collection from this game called The Cruel King and the Great Hero, which comes with a hardcover adventure book, a digital soundtrack, a cute little collector's box, and a cute little plushie of our main protagonist. Plus, this is a really cool collector's item, and I just wanted a good excuse to talk about it. But even with all those gripes, I still highly recommend you get Klonoa Phantasy Reverie. Yeah, I know, $40 does seem like a lot for just 2 games. That can take usually up to 10 hours to beat. Longer if you're going for 100% completion, including the 150 jewel count. But let's not forget, a single Klonoa game nowadays goes for usually double that price, if not triple. And the fans know it, as Phantasy Reverie was one of the best-selling games on the Switch and Steam, and probably even on PlayStation and Xbox. I don't own those consoles. We may be looking at the revival of a supposedly dead series, similar to Crash Bandicoot, and eventually Spyro. and somehow KO the kangaroo. Considering how successful this game was on launch, we could even get a collection of the handheld titles releasing in the near future. From Moonlight Museum to all the GBA titles, even getting an English version of Klonoa Heroes. Personally, I would recommend calling it the Pocket Dreams Collection. And of course, a long-awaited continuation of the series and the development of Klonoa 3. I don't know if they'll have the original team behind the Klonoa series working on it, but I am really excited to see if that's possible. The fact that Klonoa was a game series that was supposedly dead, and the last title in the series didn't come out for nearly 15 years, is a miracle in itself. And it gives me hope that many other popular franchises could even get a revival as well. The fact that we're even getting a sequel of games like Fuga Melodies of Steel, I wouldn't be surprised if there was going to be a remake of Tail Concerto and Solo Torobo in the near future. Klonoa Phantasy Reverie series is a dream come true for not just the Klonoa series, but for other obscure platformers. And if you happen to be new on my channel, make sure to check out some of my other videos, as there'll be tons of other videos coming out soon, including a first look at one of my newest projects. But until then, have a nice day, everybody.